items, digital or otherwise, that we consume arrive to us instantly and can sometimes be created on the spot. But what does the future economy sort of look like? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. We've got Robert Hackett from Fortune magazine, as well as RJ Pittman, who's going to lead us through that discussion of what's next when it comes to commerce.
Thanks.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Hackett. I'm a senior writer at Fortune, where I co-lead The Ledger, which is our sort of fintech crypto task force. And it's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be joined by RJ. RJ has, he's a tech exec whose career has spanned, across the valley from Mountain View to Cupertino and beyond. Most recently, he was the chief product officer at eBay. And you were there for 5 years, and just a couple of months ago, earlier this summer, you left.
Yep.
Why the change?
Well, take a half step back. The last 5 years was perhaps the most extraordinary phase of my career, and being part of eBay during what I would say is the most dynamic phase of the company's existence was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. The company went through an extraordinary set of changes, not the least of which was looking at how is it going to attack the next stage of growth. And a big part of that was looking at the very core internal organism or organ of that company, which was payments. And as many people probably know, a couple of years ago, we spun PayPal, a company that we had acquired and grown and nurtured for over a decade inside of eBay, into its own standalone business. And while PayPal is still a very strategic partner of eBay's, what this did was opened up the aperture and the opportunity for eBay to accelerate or re-accelerate its growth across its global footprint. It's one of the largest cross-border trade machines in the world, and having an opportunity to lead through that set of changes and to bring eBay back, to the forefront of a major global commerce provider was absolutely fantastic. And I would say, if anything, what I see is an even bigger opportunity out there to make a broader impact, even beyond the reaches of eBay, in this new world order that we live in, which we call the sharing economy. We call it a lot of different things, but the fundamental ownership models that consumers think of today have changed forever. And you can see this through some of the bellwethers of Uber and Airbnb taking a foothold on this. But boy, in my view, absolutely the very beginning. We're at the start of something extraordinarily transformational in this industry. And I want to put myself in a position to participate even more aggressively than I have.
So you mentioned, shortly after you joined, there was this big divorce. Carl Icahn, the activist investor, got involved and led a successful campaign that broke up eBay, PayPal over here, eBay over there. How did your job change in the midst of that turmoil?
Well, part of the initial remit, of course, in any company, you come in to lead product and set a global product strategy for the company, is to survey all of the assets that you have at your disposal and use them to your advantage in a very competitive market, which is global e-commerce. You have, very, very big, powerful players that you're standing up against. And eBay was unique and is unique in that it is a decentralized marketplace, arguably the inventor of the sharing economy 22 years ago. And with assets like StubHub and PayPal and eBay Enterprise, that initial job was to look at how could we do a 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. Tremendous strategic opportunities abound. And I think at the end of the day, as you mentioned, the real assessment of the value of eBay and those assets was assessed and measured both as an internal collection of assets and then what was the value of them if they were separated and external. And clearly the math proved the way that it did, and we went towards separation. And so, Act 2 of the job was actually pretty fun. It was really kind of tickling my fancy around my entrepreneurial background, which was the first 15 years of my career I spent doing startups and payments and commerce. And here we were 20 years later taking eBay on a roadshow for its second IPO all over again. this time with quite a story, right? A company that had grown from a two-person startup conducting the first cross-border trade. You may or may not know this, but the first transaction on eBay crossed borders.
Which countries?
That was the laser pointer that was sold to a gentleman in Canada. So it went from the US to Canada. It's very cool. And we've gone from 2 countries to 190. So Brad spoke yesterday about a company up in Seattle that is managing cross-border transactions for consumers in 19 countries. eBay's 10x that. And I think, again, that's one of the more compelling propositions of eBay to consumers is me as a seller. If I want to sell my old iPhone, I'm not just affording myself the opportunity to sell it to someone down the street or even across the country, but I have access to buyers in all 190 of those countries, and it's largely a seamless exercise for me as a consumer to conduct trade globally. And there are very few companies that I'm aware of beyond eBay that allow you to do that with some level of simplicity and that broad of global reach. But not without its challenges and not without its opportunities to take it several steps further than what we see today.
As you mentioned, eBay operates at a tremendous scale, something in like 200 countries or so. What are the pain points you experienced with respect to payments and making cross-border trades happen?
Well, first of all, international payment processing is just massively laborious. It is extraordinary heavy lifting to create a payment mechanism in a country outside of your own domicile. And even more so, maintaining those payment integrations with payment processors and the banking infrastructure, which is constantly evolving and modernizing in many ways as the internet becomes more pervasive, especially in the emerging markets. And so it is more than a full-time job. That's why I mentioned it was sort of the central organ of a company like eBay. And I think that's also why we paid such close attention to the health of that organ and made sure that we gave ourselves as much option value with our payment capabilities going forward. And why is that? Because as more and more of the world moves to e-commerce, and mind you, we're not at the tipping point yet, right? From the consumer point of view, I mean, hazard a guess. Does anybody have an idea of what percentage is e-commerce of the total retail in the United States? You think with all these big players out there, and now Walmart, doing a big push for online, that it'd be a pretty big number. 10%. 9% going on 10%. In China, a little bit different story. Here's a market and a country that, arguably jumped on to the internet phenomenon quite a bit later than the US, where we had a huge head start. What's the percentage of e-commerce in China today? 40%. It's adding more e-commerce users in 2 and 3 year spans than the entire population of the United States. Today online in China, there's 700-800 million people online, almost double the population of the US. And $1 trillion of business is running through the e-commerce platforms in China today alone. This is a massive opportunity. You look at it globally, and we're still in the early innings here. We talk about the importance of payments in the future. We are nowhere close to hitting critical mass. At 10, 15, 18%, take that as an average globally. That's a generous average. What happens when we're at 75% online transaction? Do we have the payment infrastructure? Do we have the scalability? Do we have the cost models in place? Because it's going to get bitterly competitive when everything, every single transaction, every type is being done digitally. Every one of those interchange basis points adds up. And as we've heard from so many great speakers at this event, the inefficiencies in the processing chains for payments, whether it's global payments and cross-border, or even a credit card settlement here in the US. It's incredibly antiquated, it's cost-ridden, and there are grounds for so much innovation. And all of the incumbents shouldn't be fearing losing any of the nest eggs that they've had in the last, several decades. Quite the opposite. It's about sort of shedding the legacy and opening the aperture to extraordinary growth opportunities where the size of the pie is going to grow 5x, 10x. If you look at the numbers in terms of just online penetration today, we have so much room to go. And one of the big jobs that I had at eBay, I'd say probably my most important job was to help the company stay out of its own way. And what I mean by that is you get to any critical mass size as a company like eBay or Apple or Google, that's an important stewardship job to have, because if you tap into a market that has such phenomenal growth potential, like what we're looking at here in commerce and global payments, it's super easy to wreck it. It's super easy to slow down the progress. It's super easy to miss the window of opportunity to capitalize on this inflection point that we're going through right now to the digital era.
So I want to broaden our focus here a little bit and talk about the big technologic changes that are going underway. What do you see as these being? What are sort of the trends that are reshaping commerce online?
Well, I'd say one of the things that I've enjoyed participating in as a product guy is step function improvements. We'll talk about payments for just a minute. In the consumer experience for making a purchase. That's probably, the first step in this equation is removing friction. And why is that so important? Well, having been in e-commerce for 25 years now, there's a few key, variables that rule the roost. Friction and speed, and arguably speed is part of friction. In terms of immediacy and convenience. But anybody who's worked in a large-scale, high-velocity, high-volume global e-commerce business or just transaction business in general will tell you that the smallest movement of the needle in terms of removing friction, creating simplicity in your checkout flow, or a one-touch buy button in your mobile app, has tremendous downstream implications to your overall business. And this is why at places like eBay and at Apple, we were maniacal about really, really perfecting that. And just when you thought, the experience couldn't get any simpler, it could. And moving, the smallest amount of information into the right place, or making the button size, maybe just a little bit bigger, could translate to tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in newfound revenue through conversion. And even more so, something I learned, in the front row seat at Google during a very, extraordinary period of growth in that company, how much they prioritize speed. And the speed at which a search result was brought back to you is measured in hundreds of milliseconds. And those milliseconds, every millisecond mattered to that customer experience. And you as a consumer don't necessarily intuit that speed, but in the aggregate over your time of using Google, it really, really added up. And it had huge implications to how engaged you would stay with the search engine. In the early days of search engines, there was no reason to anchor you to one or another. Switching costs were zero. And so the way that Google won 100% was through performance. Yes, they had great relevance, but it was that speed of instant gratification. And even if you didn't get the search you liked the first time, it was so fast to type 3 more searches in, it didn't even feel like a tax. And you bring that to commerce, same thing. If my checkout happens in 25 milliseconds or half a second quicker than it does today, that would move the needle in conversion by such huge steps. And it's extraordinary to me when I look around, especially a lot of startups and mid-sized companies, and even companies in financial services and the like, who don't put that same level of discipline and rigor around this or prioritize it as much in their strategic roadmaps, because it has such implications for customer adoption and customer growth. And I believe that the innovations that we're seeing on the forefront have to unlock a new dimension and an entirely new level of performance and friction reduction. That's going to be the thing that moves things forward, not necessarily an augmented reality experience or a VR experience for shopping. It's going to be back to some of these really, really important nuts and bolts that are going to be a huge flywheel for growth.
So we're here at Ripple's Swell event. It seems only appropriate that I ask, how excited are you, if at all, about blockchains?
If at all, yeah, very excited. And why? Well, I liken the notion of blockchain and DLT to some important architectures that emerged out of companies like Google. Some of you may know about an important architectural platform called MapReduce. And this was something that was pioneered at Google in its early days to help it figure out how to scale its infrastructure and services to get to those.
People familiar with MapReduce? You want to give a...
Basically, what MapReduce allows you to do is take a very compute-intensive job and break it up into, say, 1,000 smaller jobs, and then distribute it across a farm of servers and processes and virtual servers to basically execute on it and then bring the answer, aggregate the answer back together for you in a much more scalable and performant way, fault-tolerant way, et cetera. This moved us dramatically away from these traditional, we used to call three-tier architectures or client-server architectures with sort of a clientware, middleware, and back-end server-side architecture into something much, much more flexible, much more scalable. And of course, that technology was open sourced, and it powers most technology companies today, and certainly commerce business and the like. Everybody is using a form of this architecture, and a distributed ledger and the notion of blockchain's driving purpose to provide a similar decentralization of processing. And if we use that for processing and managing value, and if we apply that to payments, absolutely. I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting on stage at a Ripple event, but I think part of the way that works isn't to take a solution and go find a problem. I think one thing that Ripple has done that's quite interesting is created an interledger protocol, right? So the notion of, just like TCP/IP, and we heard a little bit about this yesterday, having a reliable protocol from which packets of information are moved around the internet is what makes the web work today, right? TCP/IP is it. And this is effectively, the TCP/IP for moving value. And I think thinking like that down to the sublayer, to the network layer, moving out of the applications, moving out of the business interest for a moment, and really trying to solve it, at the lowest common denominator is where you're going to have, I think, the most potential to move the entire industry in the right direction. And it obviates the needs for a lot of centralized services. I mean, one thing at eBay that we still, to this day are trying to figure out is how to build a better escrow system. Because it's a marketplace of buyers and sellers, right? It's a decentralized marketplace. And one of the big pain points is, the buyer wants to know, did the seller ship the goods? The seller wants to know, did the buyer pay? Where's the money? Who's holding it? And, you sort of had PayPal in the middle in most countries, but not in all. And it's sort of this mysterious, guessing game. And it was one of the biggest call drivers in the contact center. We have thousands of people in the contact center answering the mystery questions of where's my goods? And where's the payment? And even when the buyer did pay, by the way, didn't necessarily mean that the seller had the money and that it was settled. There was a whole other level of mystery of exactly when that was going to happen. And so as I'm listening to the narrative here and sort of the value proposition of blockchain, ledgers, certainly Ripple, and Xcurrent and Xrapid, these are the steps in absolutely the right direction that certainly for a business like ours, which is a multitude of buyers and sellers and merchants in 190 countries, we need new solutions because, as I mentioned earlier, we only need to move the needle and move the dial on some of that friction problem in very small increments to have a transformative effect on the financial architecture of our company, or of eBay, I should say. And so I'm very excited about this. I might share, a few of my concerns are whenever you're transforming an industry, not just a company or a product or an idea, half of the battle, I think President Clinton stressed this, he couldn't have stressed it enough, half of the battle is your ability to bring others along and to do so in a way that creates accretive value for everybody with managed risk, but your true effectiveness is being able to get it done in this lifetime. You have 4 billion people online on the internet today, half of the world with another half to go. So arguably still in the early innings, right? And 10% only of transactions in the US are online. Like, this is nuts. There is a massive market waiting for a much simpler, much faster, much more transparent mechanism, because when it's convenient, when it's sort of idiot-proof and you can just hit a button and stuff shows up at your house and you're not thinking about it and you don't like it and you want to return it, and everything just works clearly, reliably, and transparently, and your money comes back to you in an instant, guess what? You'll do it more. You'll do it a whole heck of a lot more. I can promise you that from just my most recent experience. It's an absolute game changer, and all of the e-commerce players out there in the world understand this fully, but they're not in position in themselves to solve this problem broadly for all participants, for all merchants and banks and financial institutions that are part of this opportunity. So we need companies like Ripple to exist and to fight the good fight to move this thinking forward, because there are tremendous economic opportunities at hand here.
Springing off the subject of blockchains, how do you feel about cryptocurrencies? Are you of the Warren Buffett camp, or sort of the Tim Draper camp, the big advocates of it, somewhere in between?
Well, for me on crypto, it's a little different story. I think I love the promise, and by the way, I think cryptocurrency as a bridge currency is perhaps one of the best first use cases we should try to push to get to critical mass or get out there. I think it works great in that regard. I could see that working very, very nicely to sort of become a lubricant in the flywheel of a cross-border trade business as complex as eBay's. It could be very, very interesting. But what's happening with crypto that is both a natural occurrence, but it's also a bit of the challenge, is the brand, right? I mean, Ripple faces a challenge with XRP, Bitcoin faces it, Ethereum, and there's still not a sufficient understanding of the purpose, the value, the capability of cryptocurrency. What everybody gets distracted by is the volatility of the value of that currency in these markets. And because there was, and still is, such a large number of global participants in what I would call sort of the opportunistic side of, trading on the value of these currencies, we're losing the plot before we've even, finished shooting the movie. And so I think, one of the things that needs to happen is, companies that are in this space need to take a big step back and invest in correctly positioning the importance of crypto, and in a sense, sort of recasting the role that it's going to play in the future of things like payments and commerce and banking at large, because the fits and starts aren't helping. At the same time, like I said, this is not uncommon when you're breaking new ground and you're completely changing the rules of the game, trying to move something forward in a very disruptive fashion. This is bound to happen. We've seen it in all industries, from the auto industry to even first generation of the web. There was a lot of glass that was broken along the way, but it's also very easy to get that cart before the horse, and it's important that some efforts happen here where we really step back and retrench, and then activate some really great examples of crypto, working in the way that sort of eschews those risks and those volatility risks and stability risks that people are pointing to. And that's why I think potentially If we get to the right liquidity someplace, that a bridge currency application for crypto is a good starting point.
So we've got just over 5 minutes left. I'd like to turn over the floor to a couple questions in just a minute. But first, I also want to ask you, there's another online marketplace that's kind of gone whole hog into blockchain lately, and that's Overstock.com, an eBay rival. What do you make of their approach to this new world?
Courageous. So as an entrepreneur, I don't fault them at all. I think, boy, that took some grit. As a public company, sitting, where I was sitting the last 5 years, and even back at Apple running e-commerce there are levels of disruption you can push. There are elements of your company's financial architecture that you can change, but it's nowhere near as easy as a startup company when you're starting with a clean sheet of paper. There are many, many expectations that have to be managed and customers you have to roll through. So what Overstock was trying to do is the kind of thing you would expect in a startup company, private company, venture-backed, and they're doing it out there in the open in a very bold and courageous way. I think they're facing the same problems, and one of the first things we saw come out of Overstock, which is great for us to watch, as an e-commerce player a few years ago, is accepting Bitcoin as a form of payment. Great, bold, interesting. Love to see how that plays out. And sure enough, you can see that the volatility of the currency could make it very hard for a retailer or a commerce player to know if they just sold an iPhone for $10,000 or 50 cents, because
By the time you buy 2 pizzas, it's worth tens of millions of dollars.
Exactly. And so the consumer proposition, and it was so early. There are industry people who could intuit the concept of Bitcoin, but the vast majority of mere mortal consumers, this is way over their head. So it's the other part of this when I talk about re-educating on the currency for the industry and crypto. I think the same has to be done for consumers. Why does this even matter as a consumer? I'm just trying to get a new pair of socks, and I gotta, work a market here, and I've got to look at what my dollar is going to convert to in Bitcoin and why. That can all be answered, but everybody's sort of running towards the solution, before we've kind of stepped back and said why we're doing this and how our consumer is really going to rationalize this mode. And so this is, in some ways, I think you can credit Overstock for starting to move us forward, but I think at the same time they created another challenge by, again, maybe putting a little bit of concern in consumers' mindsets about, the volatility of a currency, and then maybe just associating this whole blockchain and this whole crypto thing with kind of the price of Bitcoin as their consideration factor for whether they're going to participate as a consumer or not. And that's unfortunate because it's clearly, there's a much bigger proposition here, but I think it's the job of the commerce players to really simplify that and make an immediate walk-up usability sort of value proposition that any of us in the room would just sort of look at and go, wow, that's an extraordinarily better experience and better value for me as a shopper. Okay, I'm going to give it a try. Risk-free, money-back guarantee, great, why not? And I haven't seen anybody really go all in quite that way yet for the consumer. I think that's next.
So our time is running out. I want to make sure we squeeze in at least one question if we keep it tight. How about you up front?
Following up on what President Clinton said and what you just said about the importance of thinking strategically and inclusively, and I'm really impressed with your background, how do you think we can use blockchain and what Ripple has created to more efficiently and effectively include the bottom rung of the world society? Have you thought about that?
So yeah, if we can keep it to maybe a minute in response, how can blockchains create more economic opportunity and inclusion globally?
Sure. Well, I have some long-range thoughts on this. I'll try to shorten it as best I can. You think about the point of view of eBay, which I think is just one of the greatest purpose-driven companies out there with a single mission, which is to create economic empowerment for everyone. Everybody in this world has something to sell or something of value. And why can't we create liquidity for them? Whether it's here in Silicon Valley or in a village in India or in a rural area in China, it should all be one-click accessible, right? And they should be able to trade. And today it's too hard, especially if you're unbanked. And so as I was starting to talk a little bit about my interest in this interledger protocol and ILP, the idea that maybe people could start doing true point-to-point transactions where there doesn't need to be a central processing facility, and could currency just be moved literally point-to-point versus a debit and a credit, that's being reflected in a banking institution? Maybe, and maybe the financial services in these banks actually are the ones, creating these ledgers and managing this system in sort of a bankless way. Absolutely. My view is this is all about making the technology so powerful that it simplifies access and simplifies engagement for literally everyone. And I've seen the beginnings of this with some of these inroads we've made in these 190 countries during my time at eBay. And the appetite for it is massive. I'll just mention quickly in China, all of the growth in China's e-commerce that's fueling this 30, 40% growth year on year isn't coming from Shanghai, Beijing. It's coming from those rural areas where they don't even have internet connectivity until now. And it's completely transformed these farmers' lives in these communities. And they're just scratching the surface of penetration. And so I think this is a big opportunity for us. And maybe it's our responsibility, frankly, to get after this.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. You've had a tremendous career, and it sounds like there's a ton of disruption underway. We all better keep our eye on the ball.
Thanks, Robert. Great to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.